Picture this Chicago 1914 bustling immigrant community, Little Poland. We're going on a deep dive into the life of Tillie Klimek, a woman infamous for predicting the deaths of her husbands.
And the unsettling part is her predictions often came true.
Exactly. We'll be sifting through her biography and newspaper clippings from that era to try and get to the bottom of this.
What's really captivating about this case is it's not just about a potential killer. We're also looking at a community dealing with big changes, poverty shifting roles for women. Tillie Klimek, just a seemingly ordinary woman, becomes the center of a huge scandal in Little Poland.
So let's start with Tillie's background. She immigrated to the U.S. as a baby with her family.
Yeah, and she married her first husband, Joseph Mitkiewicz, in 1895. Pretty typical immigrant story, at least for the first few years.
Okay, so where did the death predictions come in?
Well, it's not like she was, walking around with a crystal ball, but rumors started when in 1914, Joseph died suddenly after a short illness, officially heart trouble.
Uh-huh.
But how fast he passed away raised some eyebrows until he quickly remarried a neighbor, Joseph Ruskowski.
Huh. Yeah.
And sadly, he also died not long after.
Hold on. Two husbands gone that quickly. That's starting to sound a little suspicious.
It doesn't stop there. Tillie then had a boyfriend who decided to break things off, and he, too, died unexpectedly.
Wow.
Now, we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions, but 3 men connected to Tillie dying in such a short time span, it's hard to ignore.
Yeah, I have to agree. That definitely makes you wonder if there's more to it than just bad luck.
Exactly, and this was just the beginning.
Oh, boy.
So Tillie then marries her third husband, Frank Kupsik, and that's where the whole death prediction thing really takes center stage.
Yeah.
Tillie starts telling everyone that Frank won't be around much longer, but it's not just vague statements. She's getting really specific.
Oh, wow.
She would even greet Frank with comments like, "You'll be dying soon," or "It won't be long now."
That's disturbing. Can you imagine being Frank and hearing your wife say those things?
And there's more. She starts knitting her mourning hat right there by Frank's bed and even bought a coffin ahead of time, saying she found a great deal.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, her behavior was so unsettling that it's not a surprise that people started speculating about her role in Frank's eventual death.
So Frank does die. It's not just a coincidence this time, right?
Right. This time, doctors suspect foul play, specifically arsenic poisoning.
Yay.
And this is where the story takes a dark turn. Authorities decide to exhume the bodies of Tillie's previous husbands.
I'm guessing they found something.
They did. Traces of arsenic were found in the remains of both Joseph and Joseph, fueling the suspicion that Tillie wasn't just predicting these deaths, she was orchestrating them.
So at this point, she's a suspect in 3 deaths.
Exactly. Now, we have to remember that arsenic poisoning was relatively common in the early 20th century. There was a readily available rat poison called rough-on rats that contained arsenic, making it tragically easy to get.
So then the question becomes, where did she get the arsenic? And how did she manage to poison multiple husbands without anyone noticing?
Well, that's where Nellie Kulik, Tillie's cousin, enters the picture.
Oh, so now there's a potential accomplice.
Yeah. According to reports, Nellie allegedly supplied Tillie with the rough-on rats. Now the details about their alleged collaboration are murky, but it seems like Nellie was at the very least complicit in Frank's poisoning.
And what was the motive? Was it just to help Tillie get rid of a husband that she didn't want?
Well, Tillie apparently complained about Frank to Nellie, and instead of suggesting a divorce, Nellie supposedly said something like, "Why not just get rid of him some other way?"
Wow, that's chilling. It really makes you question Nellie's role in all of this.
And it gets even more intriguing. The investigation didn't just start with Frank.
Okay.
Tillie was known for her cooking, and it turned out that neighbors and relatives who ate at her house had started getting sick. Tragically, some of them even died.
So now there are potential victims beyond her husbands. This is starting to sound like a serial killer situation.
Exactly. The scope of the investigation blew up. Even a dog that annoyed Tillie reportedly died from arsenic poisoning. The newspapers went crazy.
Oh, I bet.
They called this group of suspected murderous wives in Little Poland the Bluebeard Clique.
Hold on, Bluebeard Clique. Can you explain that?
Of course, the name is a reference to the fairy tale villain Bluebeard, who was known for murdering his wives.
Oh.
It was definitely a sensationalized label playing into the fears and prejudices of the time, particularly towards immigrant communities.
So are you saying that the media frenzy around the case might have been fueled by anxieties about immigrants?
It's something to think about. The early 20th century was a time of huge social change, and there was a lot of fear and suspicion directed at immigrants. And Tillie, with her alleged crimes and connection to this Bluebeard clique, She became a symbol of those anxieties.
That's a really good point. It makes you wonder if she was unfairly targeted because of her background.
It's certainly possible.
So with all this suspicion and media attention, what happened to Tillie? Did she face any consequences?
Oh, absolutely. With the mounting evidence against her, the police arrested Tillie and charged her with Frank Kupczyk's murder.
And what about Nellie?
She was also arrested and spent a year in prison awaiting trial, but the evidence against her was weaker, and without Tillie's direct testimony, the prosecution's case fell apart.
So as Tillie's trial is about to begin, Nellie's a free woman.
Yeah.
Wow, I can only imagine the tension between them during that year they spent in prison together.
The dynamics must have been really complicated. Tillie's facing a life sentence for murder while Nellie walks free despite her alleged involvement. It's a recipe for resentment, betrayal, and who knows what else.
That's a great point. It adds another layer of intrigue to this already fascinating story. Okay, so Tillie's on trial for Frank's murder. What happens next?
Well, this is where the social norms of the time, especially around women's roles, come into play. Remember, we're talking about the 1920s in America. Women were still fighting for basic rights. Their place in society was defined by their relationship to men, especially their husbands.
Right.
So a woman accused of not just murdering one husband, but potentially several. This was a huge scandal.
So it sounds like the public had already made up their mind about Tillie before the trial even started. But did that impact the actual legal proceedings? Did she even have a chance at a fair trial?
It's hard to say the trial itself was heavily covered by the media, and the details often embellished painted Tillie as a cold-blooded killer, a black widow, preying on her husbands.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful and disturbing image.
It
It really highlights how societal perceptions can affect the justice system.
So what was the verdict?
In March 1923, Tillie Klimek was found guilty of Frank Kupczyk's murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Wow, life in prison. That's a hefty sentence, especially for that time.
It was the harshest sentence ever given to a woman in Cook County at that time.
Wow. But we haven't even touched on one of the biggest questions. Why did she do it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that continues to fascinate and perplex us even a century later.
So we've got Tillie convicted, sentenced to life in prison, and Nellie acquitted, free to go. But we're still left with that big question, why? What would drive someone to do something like this? Well, remember the whole Black Widow image we talked about that might actually point to a motive financial gain? You see, Tillie had taken out life insurance policies on her husbands.
Oh, so she benefited from their deaths.
Exactly, and it turns out she stood to gain quite a bit from their deaths.
Okay, but wouldn't that be incredibly risky? I mean, wouldn't people immediately suspect her if her husbands kept dying and she kept getting those insurance payouts?
You'd think so, but in a time when women had limited financial independence, it might have seemed like the only way out.
So you're saying that her crimes, as horrific as they were, could have been driven by a desire for financial freedom. That's interesting. It's not just about greed, but about the lack of choices women had back then.
Right. We can't erase the fact that she poisoned these men, but we can try to understand what led her to do it. Imagine being stuck in a system that offered women very few options for independence. Maybe for Tillie, murder seemed like the only way to secure her future.
That's a disturbing thought, but I see your point. Especially when you consider the era, it wasn't exactly easy for women to get divorced or have control over their own finances.
And there's another layer to this, the psychological aspect. Think about her predictions. Were they really premonitions, or were they a way to control the narrative, make people afraid, and deflect suspicion?
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
Did she actually believe she had some supernatural power, or was it all just a manipulation tactic?
That's the puzzle, isn't it? Was she delusional and master manipulator, or maybe a bit of both? It really makes you question the nature of guilt remorse and how much people can deceive themselves.
Speaking of guilt and remorse, do we know how she acted after she was convicted? Did she ever express any regret for what she'd done?
Well, there are accounts of her taunting Nellie in prison, even leading her to believe that she was going to be hanged. It's hard to know for sure if it was genuine malice, a coping mechanism, or just her trying to exert control in a situation where she had none.
It's a really interesting detail, it seems like. Even facing life in prison, Tillie still felt the need to manipulate those around her. Maybe that tells us more about her personality than any confession ever could.
Absolutely, and that's what makes this duck dive so fascinating. We're not just uncovering the facts of the case, we're peeling back layers of history, societal norms, and individual psychology.
Yeah, it's like we're putting together a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing.
Exactly, and maybe that's part of what makes Tillie Klimek's story so enduring.
Because even with all the evidence, the trial conviction, we're still left with a sense of mystery. Was she a cold-blooded killer all along? Or was she a product of her circumstances, driven to do desperate things by a society that didn't give her many options?
And maybe that's the most unsettling question of all because it makes us confront the complexities of human behavior, the gray areas where societal pressures, personal desires, and individual choices all come together.
And in Tillie's case, those gray areas had devastating consequences. So many lives lost, families impacted by her actions. It's hard to even grasp the pain she caused.
Yeah, it's true. Well, her story is definitely captivating. We can't forget about the victims in all of this.
Exactly. It's important to remember that these weren't just names in a headline.
Yeah.
They were real people with lives and families who were deeply affected by her actions.
It's a good point, and it brings up a question I think is worth considering. What makes someone capable of that kind of calculated cruelty?
Right. Was Tillie Klimek just evil? Or was she a product of her environment, a woman driven to desperate measures by a society that didn't give her many options?
It's a question that's hard to answer. I mean, we've talked about the historical context, the societal pressures, even the possibility that she was desperate for money. But there's still that mystery. Was there something more going on, something darker inside of her? It's fascinating, isn't it? Even with all the evidence and analysis, we still don't have a clear answer. And maybe that's what keeps drawing us back to these kinds of stories, the need to understand the darkness within ourselves and the world around us.
I think you're right. It's not just about morbid curiosity. It's about trying to grasp just how complex human nature can be. And in Tillie's case, that complexity is undeniable. I mean, we see the calculation, the manipulation, but there's also this sense of tragedy, like a woman who, for whatever reason, chose a path of destruction.
And that's what makes a deep dive like this so interesting. It's not about judging, it's about exploring the different sides to the story, the historical context, the individual choices, the ripple effects that go way beyond the events themselves.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that shape us, the choices we make, and how those choices can have consequences, both good and bad.
Exactly. And in Tillie's case, her story is a cautionary tale, reminding us about the darkness that can exist even in seemingly ordinary people and how devastating it can be when that darkness takes over.
Well, this has been a really interesting and thought-provoking deep dive. I know I'll be thinking about Tillie Klimek's story for a while.
I think we all will. And for those listening who want to learn more, I recommend checking out the book Deadly Women. They have a whole chapter about Tillie's crimes. That's pretty chilling. And of course, there's tons of information online. Just search for Tillie Klimek and you'll find articles, historical accounts, and even some theories about her motives and methods.
And as always, we encourage you to share your thoughts with us on social media. What stuck out to you in this deep dive? What questions are you still thinking about? Let's keep this conversation going.
Yeah, because history is a dialogue. It's an ongoing exploration of the past that helps us understand our present and shape our future. And sometimes it's those unsettling stories that teach us the most valuable lessons.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and crimes of Tillie Klimek. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged.